My wife listened to an episode of this podcast. Yes.
Thank you. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm your host, Daniel Fox, here with my great friend, Thomas Balsamo, and glad to be in another conversation with you today, or for you, kind of with you, if you'll give us your feedback, but with Tom here, and we've had our share of technical difficulties, but finally up and at it here. And so how are you doing, Tom?
Well, one of those technical difficulties is that I'm really tired.
Technically, that might be a difficulty, yes.
Yeah, technically. No, I'm doing well. How have you been?
Not too bad. Been doing pretty good. Thank you. Yeah, as we get started, I want to say thank you to our patrons over at patreon.com/Reason Together for all that you do. Thank you so much for your investment and support. As we get started, Tom, I've got, it kind of may seem like neither here nor there, but I have an article that I wanted to share with you because I just thought it struck me, I guess, at this guy's approach to it. Do you mind if I bounce it off of you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this guy here is a senior lecturer in New Testament studies at an unnamed college here. I won't name the college right here. He's written numerous articles, it says, and several books. Okay, so this is a learned man, I guess. And it's talking about on this website. However, I came on here in my studies. It's talking about the church at Corinth. Okay, How would you typically describe the church at Corinth?
Earlier or later? like, are you asking me like initially or?
Sure, either later? One, both. Like a
initially, perverse, twisted, debauched, confused, immature, and petty.
Okay. So this guy is describing the church at Corinth a little bit. He says, in 1 Corinthians in particular, the apostle treats a wide range of issues affecting the community of believers, including divisiveness, litigation, food offered to idols, and class divisions at the communal meal. In so doing, he gives us an unparalleled, though hardly neutral, picture of the life of an early church. Now, I'm going to skip part of this because what struck me was later on in the article. He says, it's difficult to know the size of the Corinthian church at the time of this first letter. Scholarly estimates range from 40 to 150 persons. It's often assumed that when the whole church came together for worship, it did so in a believer's home. But Paul's distinction between church and home in 1 Corinthians 11:22 may suggest otherwise. I thought that was an interesting point, worthy of looking at there. But then it says, the church at Corinth clearly suffered from internal tensions. 1 Corinthians 1-4 reflects the problem of factionalism, where Paul identifies separate parties that claim alternate allegiances to him, Apollos, Peter, or Christ. These parties may represent splits within the church leadership. Then he says, despite conflicts within the group, the Christians at Corinth enjoyed friendly relations with outsiders. Okay, friendly relations with outsiders. Believers dined with non-believers, and outsiders might have dropped into a Christian meeting, like you see in chapter 14, verses 24-25. Christianity at Corinth thus does not appear to have been particularly sectarian or subversive. Indeed, the church at Corinth was much too cozy with the dominant culture for Paul's liking. By engaging in litigation, patronizing prostitutes, and participating in pagan cultic meals, the Corinthians were conforming to the behavior patterns of the larger society. In this first letter, Paul urges them to foster a sense of being at odds with the world. Isn't that a weird way of saying it?
What was that last sentence again?
In this first letter, Paul urges them to foster a sense of being at odds with the world. And then he finishes with this little two-line. Although Paul is critical of the Corinthians throughout much of the letter, their form of Christianity was successful. A large congregation, lively worship, and secure and amicable relations with wider society. I was like, what? Like, so he
Hmm.
basically passed over. He's like litigation, patronizing prostitutes, participating in pagan cultic meals. Paul didn't really like all that, but really overall it was successful, and they had amicable relations with wider society. And I'm like, what? Like, and it doesn't address, like, I don't know if he's just like a given, like, obviously those things aren't, but he never
Yeah.
comes out and says, no, they were carnal and they needed correction, and Paul was trying to bring them into the image of Christ. It's just like, yeah, Paul wasn't really pleased with that, but you know, uh,
Yeah.
I just found that really interesting, and that's how he ends the article. Just
Hmm.
okay.
Yeah, I'd have to read through First Corinthians again, but some of it makes me kind of wonder, are you maybe leaping a little bit with some of those conclusions? But on the other hand, I'm thinking, is it possible for a church such as the one in Corinth to have all these issues and still also be a measure of success in some way?
Well, I think over time, I mean, yeah, obviously God can use people in some sense where they're at, although I feel like he was dealing with something significant, saying, look, there's someone in your church practicing a sin that's not even mentioned among the Gentiles. You
Mm,
need to discipline this man out.
yeah,
So, I mean, there was a serious issue in the Corinthian church, and Paul dealt with that seriously.
sure.
Um, and so, I mean, I think the success is that when you get to the second letter, it's obvious that they had taken that very seriously, almost too seriously. But
Right.
they had definitely taken the apostles' words and said yes, and they sought for purity, and they were really zealous for that. That's great.
That
But
sounds successful.
that sounds successful. But he's referencing First Corinthians and talking about these major errors, and then says, and then the way he describes Paul urges them to foster a sense of being at odds with the world. That's just a really strange way of saying that.
Yeah.
And then like, hey, guys, you need to start thinking as if they're your enemy. Okay, well,
Hmm.
yeah, right. And then basically saying, so Paul's critical of it, but really it's successful.
Yeah.
And then he gives those three.
Well,
It's successful for those reasons: a large congregation, lively worship, and secure and amicable relations with wider society.
so you think that's how he's defining success in a church?
Yeah, maybe at least as indicators of
Large congregation and
lively worship
lively worship.
and secure and amicable relations with wider society. I could think of other indicators as like doctrinal soundness and
Yeah.
and love for each other and evangelism, things like that would be
Yeah. Well, I
functions.
mean, the whole large congregation thing is just kind of a moot point. It's stupid and
Hmm.
irrelevant.
Hmm.
The what was the second thing? Lively worship.
Lively worship.
Completely subjective. Completely
Wait, and
subjective.
where did they get that from? Because people were speaking out of order when they were using the gift of tongues. Yeah, I bet that got lively. I bet it did. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it did. Yeah, right.
keep it up.
Right. But I mean, if that's his definition of success, I mean, some people just don't have that kind of personality where they're going to be what others might call lively. um, so, but yet they're no less worshiping the Lord. And what was the last thing that he said?
Secure and amicable relations with wider society. I mean, when the outside society likes your church, boom, successful, right?
Well, I mean, he said secure and amicable. I don't know that that necessarily implies that they liked them.
Okay, maybe not.
I think it's good that we have secure and amicable relationships with those outside of the church, and I think
Right.
that can be done. It's achievable. But I guess my concern with an article like that, as underwritten, I suppose, as it might be,
That's a good way to put it.
it's just it needed more development because the
Mhm.
points are just too nebulous. My concern with an article like that is it goes to one extreme in which any church can be a success if it meets these incredibly vague, incredibly low bar qualifications that I have randomly chosen to stick at the tail end of my article. Um, but the other extreme is that we look at it and we say no church can be successful unless everyone that's shown up on Sunday is just this pristine superstar A+ Christian,
Right. Yeah,
when
I
he
understand what you're
smiles his
saying.
teeth
Yeah.
glint, you know. Um, Because I mean, I think the fact is a church can have some pretty nasty things going on sometimes amongst new converts, and there can still be success in a church like that,
Sure.
depending on how the church responds to it.
Right. Right.
And the response is not always immediate. It's not. It sometimes takes development.
Well,
But
in the same way that you think about a family, like you want to be perceived as a successful family, right? And then
yeah,
your kid gets out there and does something stupid, or whatever, and says something, and you're like, oh, no, and you feel as a parent, you're withering inside maybe what your child just said or what they did, because your family's not perfect and you're raising children that don't always have good
right,
judgment. And it's the same way, obviously, in a church family, that you have should ideally have younger believers involved. They don't always know what to say, or they're not always super doctrinally
right,
sound in everything that they're sharing, but they've got a heart
right,
that's headed in the right direction.
right. Interesting article. Are we going
Okay.
to link that in the show notes?
Sure. Yeah, you bet.
Okay, that'll be good.
All right. So any questions you want to deal with here? We got a bit of feedback here as well.
We do, yeah. We've got this one here. What episode was that? It might have been maybe 2 episodes ago that we talked about. You brought up the phrase, "Is God in control?" or something.
Yeah,
God is in
I think that was
control.
a couple episodes ago. Yeah.
And we got some feedback here from No Name.
Oh, no name. Okay. Well, thank you,
Uh,
no name, in advance.
yeah, from No Name. It says here, along with what Daniel said about the cliche, God is in control. Which, by the way, before I read the rest of the email, what was your quick take on the phrase "God is in control" in the episode? Do you remember?
If I remember correctly, what I was addressing was the kind of ascribing everything to God's immediate design, if you will, like God's doing this to you. If I'm remembering correctly.
Okay. Okay. So they go on and they say, along with this, isn't it best to say that in favor of man's free will, God has chosen to basically have a hands-off approach to day-by-day events, choosing rather to govern the world by the principles he instilled in it at creation. The physical rules like gravity and physics determine the physical results of our decisions, just as the spiritual principles God set for the world are largely responsible for the consequences of our moral decisions.
What's kind of funny is that like you're reading what I sense here by the end of that question was kind of a deep response. And I'm over here like fighting with the sucker package, trying to get this sucker open for my daughter. Okay, I just got it. So there we go. So I'm absolutely clueless to that feedback. If you could,
Well, I'll give you the short version of it. Basically, whoever this is that's replying is suggesting that isn't it better to see the idea of God in control as being limited to a degree by God having put some laws in existence in the universe already. Physical laws, natural laws,
yes,
moral laws, even, he says.
right. And he's the
At the end
designer
here.
of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he references gravity and physics determine physical results in our decisions. And then he says spiritual principles that God set forth for the world are largely responsible for the consequences of our moral decisions.
Right. In other words, we're oftentimes, and I think I may have given this illustration in the podcast, that you slam your foot into a door frame accidentally, and oh man, I'm in pain. God, why are you doing this to me? Well, God's not doing that to you. That's just natural, if you will, natural law, that when your toe collides with an immovable object, there's going to be, the toe is going to move, something's going to hurt, your body's built in there. So it's not God's, God is judging me for running into the door. No, you basically violated a certain law and it brought about a certain consequence.
Yeah.
That's the way it was designed. And spiritually, the same thing is true. If you violate, principles of good financial stewardship, if you violate principles of friendship, if you violate moral principles, well, yeah, there's going to be consequences tied to those things. And we don't necessarily have to say God is immediately right there judging you. I mean, yes, it's built into it's built into the design that, yes, it is something to draw you back, but it's a consequence of that violation.
So you're saying God is kind of mostly hands off with.
Oh, I wouldn't say he's
such
mostly
things.
hands off, but I mean, I'm saying that
Okay.
I guess because I mean, I don't, my mind's not big enough to comprehend everything that he's doing to know what's actually hands on technically. But,
Right.
but as far as a lot of those things a lot of the things that happen in life are dealing with consequences of our actions.
Sure. As I was reading it, I was pulling up a note here that, or as you were responding, I was pulling up a note here that I have on Acts 17:28, which says, "For in him we live and move and have our being,
Mm-hmm.
as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring." And I cross-referenced there in that note. I have a couple of cross-references written down. Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
In Romans 11:36, Paul writes, "For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory in the church." And then I cross-reference. I made a little chain reference thing here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then Ephesians 1 says, Paul writes about God. I'll just kind of shorten it here, give you the important section here. According to, I'll just read the whole thing, actually. We got time. "In whom also we have obtained inheritance, being predestinated according to the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will."
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's kind of the one that I land on here, that God worketh all things after the counsel of his own will.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, that may be kind of pretty big, but I mean, couldn't part of the counsel of his own will be that the design works? You know? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, just saying that is everything that happens a decree of God? You know, when I stubbed my toe, he decreed that I would be in pain. Well, I mean, no. I mean, you know, what I'm saying, like, well, yes, he designed it. That's how he designed it, so it's going to work. And yet, did he decree for that specific action? He stubbed his toe. Boom, give him pain.
Right.
I decree it. Well, I don't see it that way. That it has to be that way. So I'm finding your verse again here. What verse was that?
Which one?
The worketh account. Okay, verse 11. Verse 11. Who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. So anyway, as far as,
I guess that's why I ask, because the word worketh sounds fairly active rather than hands off. You know what I'm saying? And
right, but I mean, at some point there has to be some contextual limitation to that verse, because the Calvinist or hyper Calvinist is going to take that to an extreme and say everything that happens is essentially the decree of God. Every mistake I make, Adam's choice in the garden to rebel against God himself, that was of God. That's what they're going to say, that he becomes the author of everything because he works everything. Nothing operates against his desire. And yet there's scriptures that indicate that it does. So I think in some ways there's layers to his desire.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
That last part anyway is, for instance, 1 Thessalonians 4:3 does seem to indicate that there are things that happen contrary to God's desire.
What does that verse say?
That has to do with our sanctification. "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication." And yet it's pretty clear that not every Christian abstains from fornication.
Well, right. Peter says he's not willing that any should perish, but do they? Yes. Because, you're also considering the level that he has given man a free will. That is his desire. That's his choice. And he lets that work. It doesn't mean that when that works, then it's contrary to his will, because that was his will. And yet he's not willing that any should perish.
And Matthew 7:21, Jesus said, "Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven." Not everyone's going to enter the kingdom, so clearly some didn't do his will. So there's clearly, and I like the way you say it, layers. And layers might be a good word for it, or
At least for our human mind to
Yeah,
understand it. Right.
yeah, good point. But I mean, neither one of us would disagree that if God does decree something, it happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yet, I think that's different than if God commands something, because people do disobey. They can resist in some sense.
It's an interesting distinction, but yeah, I see a decree and a command. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So in a sense, he has some will of decree and some will of command. Maybe those would be a couple of layers that we could, if we were going to give them terms.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how, going back to Ephesians 1:11, I can't see God's hand. I can't see God's approach to being in control of things as being very hands off. You know what I mean? Just because of what that verse says, that He worketh all things according to His will.
Yeah, and
But I think there's probably a very small faction of the world that would take that to an extreme to suggest that every little stupid thing we do, God decreed it to happen, and thus it happened. A very nihilistic approach to life. I don't know that many actually take that view, and I don't think it's fully supportable
but
at all.
I think using the word hands off sounds very deist. That
Yeah.
He's removed. Well, no, he's not removed. Like you read earlier, was it Acts 17:11? In Him we live and move and have our being.
Yeah.
I mean, you're always operating inside, if you will, God. I mean, there's nothing outside of Him, and again, His presence and His control. So
you just reminded me of another verse, and I'm trying to see if I can remember where it was. I think it was in Colossians 2, about sustaining.
Yeah, in Colossians,
upholding all things. I can't remember which it was. I'm pretty sure it's in Colossians, somewhere in 1-3 there. But yeah, another verse there that supports the idea that God is intimately involved in creation to the point of sustaining things.
Yes, Colossians 1:17.
That's it, 1:17.
By Him all things consist.
Yeah. And there's another verse I was thinking of that kind of comes to mind with that, is that He upholdeth all things by the word of His power.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no idea where that is, I'm going to be honest. But yeah, so I guess the thing is, what we're talking about is two different extremes that people often can look at the matter of God being in control. And I think both of the extremes are wrong when they use one set of scriptures to silence another set of scriptures. So, and what I mean by that is when you have those who will say, well, God sets up these laws, spiritual laws and moral laws in the universe and physical laws, and He's just He lets mankind do their thing, and whatever happens, happens. Well, whatever verses they use to support that, if any, they're using that to silence these other scriptures that I've read off here that suggest that God is intimately involved in His creation. And then on the other extreme, you have those who use those second set of verses to silence the first half. And so it's like you have to let them both speak.
Right. You have to balance them, not silence one or the other.
Right.
Yeah. Recognizing Hebrews 1:3 is what you're looking for on that other passage.
Right.
Upholding all things by the word of His power.
Good. Well, thank you to whoever you are that sent in that feedback. Let me write that reference down. Hebrews 1, what was it?
1:3.
1:3, and it was Colossians 1:7 on the other one. I can find it.
Yeah, 1:17.
1:17. Okay. Got it. All right. Anything we want to cover on that, or is that one pretty much done? I think that one's done.
Oh, we're done. Yep.
Okay. What's next?
Looks like we have feedback on making the world a better place.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me read this one here. Omar writes, I think when most Christians talk about making the world a better place, they have in mind Jeremiah 29:4-7. There, in a letter that Jeremiah sent to the exiles in Babylon, God instructed the exiles to build houses, plant gardens, marry and have children, and to seek the peace, shalom, of the city. That would be like the idea of wholeness, and to pray for it. Because as they were a blessing to this city, they would in turn enjoy the blessing. This was even though God told him they'd only be there for 70 years. Good point. If we Christians are exiles in a hostile world, perhaps this passage helps us see how God would want us to treat the world. I suppose other verses give us instruction as well. In Matthew 5:9, Christians are told to be peacemakers, and in Matthew 5:45, we see the example of God who makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So going back to that idea of making the world a better place is basically he's saying having this relationship with it. Now, my question or my point, a statement I would insert there is, how do you seek the peace of a city? What does that mean? Does that mean that you pay your taxes and try to get involved in like the local fish fry, and the food pantry? Or, what does that mean? Well, ultimately, at its core, it basically means to them that you uh, give them a representation of God, that you interact with them in an appropriate way. Now, yes, you get involved in wholesome things, and you demonstrate your care for them, and through that, you attempt to influence them. I would say for Christ, certainly prayer would be a part of that, as he mentions. To be peaceable in a society is not to stay quiet and let them do what they do, and not ruffle feathers or not go against the grain. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily being peaceful. Seeking the peace of them or being a peacemaker is trying to bring people to peace with God, and in the process, that means helping them to understand who He is. So.
Yeah. This is correct. And I didn't go back and listen to the episode in which we talked about that. And I hope we or I didn't come across as to suggest that we shouldn't try to, in some sense, make where we live a better place. I think really what we're talking about is how that's accomplished. And, it doesn't always look like we're doing that to others when we tell them the truth.
Yeah. And I think it can, and I will say maybe to this point, to maybe his broader view here, and I like, that I do like the thought that it's more than just giving out a gospel tract. Our conversations can be more than the gospel, strictly defined. What I mean is that, we can have relationships with people in which we talk about life and we talk about their life and what's going on, and demonstrate we genuinely care for them as people, and what's going on in their lives. And we can be involved in different avenues of life. And of course, in all of it, we should be representing Christ, reflecting His character. And yes, wanting to have those gospel conversations. But, if someone thinks that all I can do to make the world a better place is strictly give the gospel, go door to door and give the gospel, and outside of that, I just sort of hole up in my home, do what I want to do, and I go out and give the gospel. No, there is an involvement in the society and a connection there, I would say at times. So
I think this goes back to a conversation we had. Well, I'm betting this was a long, long time ago now on the podcast about should we have friends in the world? And we talked about the difference between having a friend in the world and having friendship with the world.
Yeah.
And that was a long time ago, I think now. And, it's okay to have unsaved people as your friends and seek to win their soul, be an influence to them, and keep that friendship maintained, and try to be a light to them for the Lord. That doesn't mean you're always giving them the gospel every time you're around them. But I think the illustration you used one time was from Greg Kokel, about a pebble in their shoe. Can you remind me about that? What was that?
Yeah, he talks about, putting a stone in someone's shoe. Basically, you're sometimes just giving people a thought to bring a discomfort to their worldview, to give them something that kind of keeps gnawing at them in a way that they have to grapple with, because you can't necessarily give them a full presentation of the gospel. They may not even understand it, but if you put a stone in their shoe, you kind of are getting a step in the right direction. Another example of that being a friend to someone who's yet unsaved and yet used powerfully to influence that person for Christ was the late Nabil Qureshi, who was a Muslim but encountered a Christian, whether it was in high school or college, maybe it was college, and they were on a debate team together or something like that. And as he tells the story, he said he saw this David, with his Bible open, and he thought, oh, great. Yeah. Another Christian. Let's go, because he was used to taking down Christians and arguing with them. And so, he started into this little rant against, trying to destroy Christianity. And David came back with this powerful argument for the authenticity of scripture. He's, like, you're lying to me, anyway. And so it ended up in this big debate, and they became really good friends. He said, I was there when his first child was born. I was in his wedding or whatever it was. And in time, it was a significant progress of really grappling with the truth that he was finding in his quest for truth as being challenged by his friend David, and finally came to the Lord and impacted people for Jesus Christ. And then he's passed away now. But anyway, there's a story there, of a man that really connected with him, and they became close on a personal level, and yet it was directing him and influencing him to Christ.
Good. Moving on, just a quick bit of feedback here. This is from Nicole, and this is important feedback because I want to make sure that I get these things right. So I tried to remember it was a particular illustration, and she straightened me out on it here. She says, in this show, Tom was trying to remember a quote about opinions. I've never heard the one about diapers, but I have heard and used this. Opinions are like armpits. Everyone has two, and they both stink. Have a blessed day, Nicole. And by the way, she says, please tell your wives I said hello.
I will. Thank you, Nicole.
Yes. Which, in other news, speaking of my wife, this is gonna blow you away. This is gonna blow your mind. This is life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
My wife listened to an episode of this podcast. Yes.
Thank you.
So I just want to put that out there, and I'm not really going to say anything more about that. I just think that's kind of I don't know, earth-shattering in some ways.
All right. Well, now I'll have to challenge my wife. Be like, Tom's wife listened to the podcast.
That's exactly right.
Just saying.
I gave you that as ammunition. So you're welcome.
And more than that, she also offered us some feedback or a question. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, I think, basically, it was just a link to an Instagram post. I think the question basically stands for, it's self-explanatory. The link is to an Instagram post that, interesting how they use Instagram here to actually like put an article in an Instagram format.
Yeah, it's kind of odd.
I guess, that works for them. So it's from the Gospel Coalition, and it says, the title of it is God Will Give You More Than You Can Handle. And he's basically arguing against the statement, which I can resonate with arguing against common statements. But the statement, the Bible promises God won't ever give you more in life than you can handle. And he's arguing against that. Without reading through the whole article, do you want to give any comments on it? Have you read the article?
Yeah, I kind of perused it briefly. If I can try to summarize it, I think it was basically that when you're going through something difficult and somebody says to you, well, God won't give you more than you can handle. Thus, what you're going through, as hard as it is, God must think highly enough of you that he thinks you can handle this. And it essentially turns a trial manward. It makes it sort of a self-centered thing. Additionally, it brings in the idea of fairness into the equation, that God is required to only give you what you can handle and never a sliver more. And he's essentially arguing against that point. And he uses 2 Corinthians 1:8 as one of his, and I say his, I don't know who's writing this. I think it's 2 Corinthians 1:8. For Paul writes for
Mitch Chase is his name.
Mitch Chase. Okay.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians 1:8 says, "For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life."
Mm-hmm.
Emphasis on above strength there, which essentially is to suggest more than you can handle. But I mean, how do you define the word handle? Like, if you survived it, does that mean you handled it? I mean, if you didn't die, is that the definition of handling it?
Well, I can. My thought is that as he's describing the use of it, yeah, it's poorly used to say to anybody and everybody, God's not going to give you more than you can handle. Because to me, it's only understood, and I feel like that statement at least should be, if not what originally was used, in the context of a Christian, is saying that as a Christian who has access to the grace of God, God's not going to give you more than you can handle. Was it I want to say 2 Corinthians 7:14, if that's if that exists.
4:17.
Is 4:17 where it says, God there is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man.
No, that's 10 something. Yeah. No, I was thinking of the one he references in the article, which is 2 Corinthians 4:17.
Yeah. Okay. I don't remember. Oh, I see. Okay, and I don't think I'd gotten that far in the article.
Yeah, he says, "For our light affliction is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." In other words, saying it's a light, that basically everything, and I've heard this preached before, that thus everything should be considered a light affliction.
Right, which, I mean, comparatively, as a matter of perspective, but he's saying when you appeal to somebody who's just, their life has been wrecked, there's no good time for that, and something traumatic has just happened, and you say, hey, but God's not going to, you must be able to handle it, buddy. You can, well, okay, maybe that's not the best statement. And to an unsaved person, they can't handle it, because to me, it is almost assumed that, well, I can handle it by the resources of the Holy Spirit. And I think he might agree with that. As far as the passage with Paul saying we were pressed beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life, I feel like there's a difference between here, maybe what we're talking about, spiritual ability or emotional ability versus physical ability. Obviously, I can find myself in situations where physically I'm in peril, that I might die. That doesn't mean I can't handle this. I mean, in the way that I think it's typically understood, obviously I can't handle, like, you shoot me 3 times, I can't handle that. And I don't, that's, what I mean? To me, that's a different thing than saying spiritually, if you are right with God, there is always an avenue. In other words, he's never going to give you something that's absolutely going to destroy you. He's always going to work
in the spiritual sense. Is what
yes, yes, and as a Christian, especially, that God, there's always resources to bring about blessing. All things work together for good to them that are the called according to His purpose. But you understand what I'm saying? That I feel like if you understand it in a context of connecting with the Lord, maybe that's not the best way to say it, of having the resources that He offers to the believer through Christ and through the Holy Spirit, that there's nothing He's going to give you can't handle as you're relying on Him. But obviously outside of that, yeah, there's a lot we can't handle, because in our humanity, we're very frail. And to me, that's a given. But if He's maybe addressing that for people to say, look, stop using this so widely to just tell anybody that they can handle what comes into their life. No, they can't. That's not a good use of it. I would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So we would agree generally with the point of the article.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
So, all right. Good. Thanks, Rosa, for not only listening, but writing in and offering us feedback. And so challenge to other listeners. You see an article that you say, boy, what do you think of that? That just doesn't seem quite balanced. Or something sticks out to me, send it our way. Just
Yeah.
even send us a link with a few thoughts, maybe what your thoughts were, what your question is. Reason Together podcast at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Once you type it in the first time, I think your internet provider there will, or your, what do I say? Your
Email.
browser, your email provider. Thank you. Your email provider will kind of like memorize it. Next time you'll just go REA, boom, it'll be there, right?
Yeah,
And you'll be
that's
able to
right.
respond that much easier the next time.
Yeah, you can add us to your short list.
Yay.
So like all the most important people in your life that you contact immediately,
Right.
give
like,
us like number 3. We'd be
Yeah.
happy with that.
Be like mom, and
Yeah.
then like pastor, and then Reason Together.
No,
Boom.
like 911, that would be
Okay.
kind of up there. And then maybe, mom, and then
mom's always first, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
your leg could have just been chopped off, and instead of calling the ambulance, you're like, call mom.
Yeah.
You're saying,
And then third, just have Reason Together podcast at Gmail. Right there.
Yeah.
And
the funny thing is, I don't know if dad's even in that, like in number 7. Like mom knows first thing, and then dad, he might find out at supper that, we nearly killed ourselves, but like mom knew right away. Dad just gets home and he finds an ambulance and he's like, what? I didn't even know.
Well, on that familial note, we're going to say goodbye for now on this one.
Yeah, just give us some feedback, please.
Yes.
All right.
Give Daniel your feedback on that one.
All right. Thanks again for listening. We're encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.